Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in Paul and the Faithfulness of God by N.T. Wright, the Larger Paul Project by N.T. Wright. We're going to take a look at a lesson now in the first part on the Apocrypha and the Jewish mindset in the first century. And N.T. Wright does look at the Apocrypha because it does give us a good thought picture of what that Jewish mindset was, how the Jews were dealing with the delay of the returning doxa glory to the temple. And so it becomes a reflection of the Jewish mindset and the mindset of Saul during the first century. Let's begin by looking at the triad on the left. We're going to look at pages 135 to 145. We're going to take up the first block, which shows that the Jews in the first century had a varied messianic expectation. And Wright says there are four conclusions to be drawn concerning the retold story of Israel. First, difference. Every writer who told Israel's story emphasized their own significant points. There was never a singular picture of the Messiah. Second is commonalities. The lineage of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Exodus, and Torah seem to be the common sequence. And Phinehas usually represented the godly zeal, which was appropriated by the first century Pharisees. And Daniel 9 is taken up because it posits the idea of an elongated exile. There was a reacquaintance with Daniel. There was a rediscovery of Daniel because of the elongated oppression under Rome. Then in C, we look at the participation as current. Ancient events were linked to contemporary analogies. And this is especially so in the Wisdom of Solomon literature. Israel was to fulfill the ancient promises now by ushering in the new creation. And they took up the expectation of the coming king from David. So participation had as its horizon deliverance out from under oppression and the reigning world sovereignty of the Messiah. But it was a tragic story that evolved during this elongated exile under Rome, being exiled in your own country. Psalm 105 is an exception to this rule, says Wright, but usually there's the picture of a worsening bad condition which finally reaches deliverance after long, elongated exile and suffering. There's an appeal made to Abraham and to David within the covenant, but usually it's a story crashing down into darkness, which eventually leads to the Messiah, but not as a particular messianic figure. The Messiah always had various representations for the first century Jews. That's key for Wright here. He says the Messiah always had various particular representations. He could be the warrior king, the lion, the fountain, and the vine. He could be Daniel's world ruler. But eventually, Israel's story would reach its goal through the coming Davidic Messiah. But they had a very detailed and varied look of hope toward this coming Davidic Messiah. There was not a singular agreed upon understanding. So now in our day we look back, we want to organize things and say there was this belief of the Judaic Jews who took up their view toward the Messiah, but we don't have a singular particular picture. Let's move on to block 2. And Professor Wright tells us that even though there wasn't a singular particular picture of the coming Davidic Messiah, there was a singular theme of the tragic Israel story. It's a common theme found in Philo, Ezra, Baruch. There's always the longer thematic narrative, which was coupled with this tragic story. There's the long thematic narrative of the faithfulness of God, the faithfulness of the covenant God. So here's where that title comes for this book by N.T. Wright. Even within the elongated exile, being slaves in their own land, Israel still also held the elongated theme of the faithfulness of the covenant God. God and creation are both faithful. Faithfulness is working through the long history of Abraham. The Messiah will embody faithfulness. First century thought has this image in their hearts of a Messiah embodying faithfulness. And after Paul's conversion, he realized that his Jewish expectation had been fulfilled in Jesus Christ, and that Jesus Christ embodied this divine faithfulness. So we have varied expectation, we have singular tragic theme, and singular expectation of divine faithfulness. So let's move on and take a look at Block 3. In Block 3 we have that history of faithfulness, that elongated parallel history of faithfulness to parallel the elongated exile under Roman oppression. The Second Temple period did represent Israel's ongoing extended or elongated exile. The Jews were alienated from power. It created an adoption of the Deuteronomy scheme of sin, exile, and restoration. So the Jews were living in the middle Deuteronomy schema of elongated exile. But the Jews were still understood as the advance guard for the return from exile. They were the first fruits. They were supposed to be the sign of the coming Davidic Messiah. And they were God's people. They lived within the elongated exile, but they also lived within the elongated faithfulness of the covenant God. Therefore, they were the sign of the coming Davidic Messiah. But they did take up the Deuteronomy prophecy. And Wright says that our Protestant faith today needs to negate any idea of breaking off from this longer thematic story. We need to take it up, even today. We need to stay away from over-concentrating on individual conversion and take up the story of salvation, the Israel story of salvation, which is our history as believing Christians. Now, Note 4, we'll take a look at that idea of continuing exile. Daniel 9 became vital as a text for first century Jews, where a world ruler would emerge out of Judea. And the Jews felt that disobedience toward God had brought on this extended exile under Roman occupation, but they still took up a singular historical sequence, and deliverance was to come, but only after 490 years. So debate was constantly being taken up over understanding and trying to understand, when will the 490 years come to an end? When will the elongated exile end? The Pharisee zealots, the zelotes of the Pharisees, felt that they could calculate when the Son of David would come. They had an arrogant, optimistic but arrogant, prideful understanding that they could calculate when the Davidic Messiah would come and the 490-year elongated exile would end. So Paul, who was educated in the Hillel school but then moved to the Shammai school, in both of those schools, Paul would have been taught that the end of the 490-year exile was coming to an end. They would be delivered from oppression under Rome by the militant coming Davidic king and Messiah. Remember, the Shammai were militant. They were militant. The Hillel were passive, but the Shammai were militant. So we get a little first inserted triad here, and it begins with the messianic expectation of the world ruler of Daniel 9, because Saul was a Jew living under elongated exile, under Roman oppression. He had this expectation, and he had been taught by Gamaliel and by the Shammai rabbis also that they were now taking up Daniel 9 in a very personal way for their current situation. But there was, in Block 2, there was, along with this elongated exile, there was the elongated theme of the faithfulness of the covenant God. That was the longer thematic narrative. So exile and deliverance would come after the 490 years of elongated exile under Rome, and the Son of David would appear and deliver the Jews. So we get to, in pages 135 to 145, we get a great look at varied expectation, singularity of theme, and history of faithfulness. I'll say that again. Varied messianic expectation, a singular theme of the tragic Israel story, but coupled with the history of the narrative of the faithfulness of the covenant God. That was Saul's first century mindset. That was his first century mindset. But now, Professor Wright's going to take us on to the portrait of that mindset of elongated exile. What's the picture that we get? And Professor Wright wants to draw a picture for us in pages 145 to 155. We're going to look at that next. So let's move over to the triad on the right. And Professor Wright says that the first century Jews took up the notion of looking for the true return. Many false messiahs had come on the scene, but the Jews were looking for the true return of the authentic Davidic messianic king. So there was a controlling story during the first century of Daniel's extended 490-year elongated exile. The starting point of this exile was based on the apocalyptic Jewish literature, and it was assumed that it started at the end of the rule of the king of Judah. Now note too, understanding this first century theme of true return can be found by examining the mindset of Qumran community, because they voluntarily exiled themselves to Qumran to live in true dedication to Yahweh and truly live within proper interpretation of the Torah, they thought. So we can look at them as not that Saul was there, but that they would reflect the general Jewish mindset of the frustrated Jews in this elongated exile. Wright says there is the Cave 4 scroll on the exegesis of Deuteronomy 30. It protested against the seekers after smooth things, which meant the Pharisees, because primarily the Qumran community was Sadducee-based. But it also did affirm the temple codes of practice, and it did present a single Israel narrative, and that, of course, led to this continued exile and this voluntary exile of the Qumran community, which believed that they were truly living the proper dedication to Yahweh. But this document did promise and posit that Israel would reach the point of true return of the true Messiah, and that the foretaste of the coming of the true Messiah was the truth of Qumran, the truth of their dedicated practices, their code of proper interpretation of the Torah. They were strict fundamentalist Sadducees. They opposed the rising up of the Pharisees in Jerusalem. They voluntarily exiled to Qumran to create the proper community of dedicated Jewish believers. They felt they were the foretaste of the coming true Messianic Davidic king. So that's the first portrait of this elongated exile we get. We get the example of Qumran. And they felt they were the foretaste. If you look at note 3, they also had an eschatological outlook. And their eschatological outlook in this true community was looking for the teacher of righteousness. The Jews are instructed to take up the stance of a circumcised heart, sincere, reverting back to the Torah and back to the true book of the law, and they anticipated the coming of the teacher of righteousness. They had the Hodiyat hymn of the coming teacher who will scourge the earth in judgment, and that referenced Daniel 9:27, and that will put an end to the 490 years of exile. They were looking for the teacher of righteousness to end the 490-year elongated exile under Roman oppression. There's also the Cave 1159 scroll that took up the promises of Deuteronomy and blended them with the concept of the coming Davidic Messianic king. So Qumran was all about true worship, true Jewish worship. Qumran was about protest through voluntary exile. Qumran was all about becoming an aggregate picture of what was really Saul's mind also. They just made it concretely visible in voluntarily exiled community, but Paul possessed the same frustration. He possessed the same eschatological outlook, and in all probability, because we know that Paul was a great teacher and studied under Gamaliel, we might even believe that Saul was also looking for a teacher-type Davidic Messianic king, and not simply a militant Messiah, but with Paul we could almost also pick up the idea that he probably did anticipate a teacher also. So he was a blend between the Hillel and the Shammai, I think. He had that teaching under Gamaliel, but he also did go over to the Shammai, militant, fundamentalist Pharisees. He had a little bit of both, so I think he could have been anticipating a teacher Messiah also. Let's move on to block 2. Let's take a look at the eschatology of the coming teacher of righteousness. In block 2, it's drawn from Leviticus 25. There is the time of liberty that intersects the space of exile. Eschatological time has already intersected the elongated space of exile. So Israel is languishing in elongated exile, but the promised land will enjoy its Sabbath. The promised land to the Jews will enjoy its Sabbath. And if Israel will confess its iniquity, God will rescue Israel from elongated exile. So, if you look at note 3, what does this intersecting of liberty, of eschatological liberty, do for the meaning of continued exile, or elongated exile? It's the time when Israel is subject to the rule of foreign nations, like Roman oppression, living in anticipation of the ending of the 490-year elongated exile of Daniel, looking toward the God who will liberate according to his faithfulness. They still held that elongated narrative of the faithful covenant God. And is there a foretaste of real return already happening? Ezra says that a remnant have returned as a little brightening within the ongoing elongated slavery to Rome. Therefore, Israel is a slave in their own land, but they are anticipating and looking toward a return of a new Moses-type Messiah king. They're looking for the return of a new Moses-type Messiah. So we do have the thematic picture of the coming teacher of righteousness. it gives the Jews a very definite eschatological outlook, and it's an eschatological outlook that has already intersected elongated exile. Let's look at block 3, the portrait of exile and an eschatology of a teacher of righteousness. Both lead to the fountain of wisdom concept. The book of Baruch takes up the promise of Deuteronomy 30 by stating that that the word is near, and Baruch also does posit the great poem of wisdom from 329 to 4:4 says, Wright, the land will be flattened out for Yahweh's doxa glory. God has given his wisdom in the Torah. By taking up the Torah wisdom, Israel can take up this eschatological time within the elongated exile right now and start living toward liberation. Also, the Apocrypha book of Tobit does speak of the Israel story and does speak of the elongated exiled people of God, and also posits a fresh ingathering of Israel within the faithfulness of the covenant God. So in this lesson we get a great look at N.T. Wright telling us that regardless of what we believe concerning the Apocrypha, that this literature does give us valuable information about the first century Jewish mindset, the Jews who were continually frustrated over the empty Holy of Holies. They were waiting for the doxa glory of the covenant God to return to the temple. They had that proto-temple theology that we already discussed. So these Apocrypha documents are important, says Professor Wright, because we get a picture of Paul's early mindset as Saul, as the Jewish believer who had studied in the Hillel and the Shammai school both. We get a picture of his hope by examining the Qumran community and their voluntary exile, and also Apocrypha documents. So very important to understand that Professor Wright is telling us, regardless of your own view toward the Apocrypha, whether they're scripture, not scripture, what their authority is or is not, one thing we can say for sure is that they do present the Jewish mindset in the first century of frustrated anticipation of the returning doxa glory to the temple. We need this when we need to understand why Qumran was a protest community. How did they become a protest community? What does the Apocrypha tell us about this protest and anticipation of the coming Davidic Messianic king? That's going to wrap up this lesson, and then we are going to look at a brief summary graphic triad also.